Welcome to our audiobook for this week. This time it's a story called The Curse of Somantusan, written by Gary Hill and read by Gary Hill. And the copyright date is 2019. All rights are reserved.
Greg Kotep's phone rang. He looked to see who was calling and curtly answered, "Yep." The voice on the other end had news of interest. Kotep had been staring out the window of Delia's kitchen, sipping his coffee and waiting for breakfast to come to the table. Suddenly all his attention was directed to the phone at his ear. "What? How is that even possible? You sure it's not some kind of elaborate prank? I'll get over there as soon as I can. In the meantime, keep this quiet and don't let anyone in there. I want to be the first to see it. I'll meet you in Cairo. I'll call you to let you know what flight I'm coming on. If I get all the way over there and this is just a joke, I'm going to be thoroughly pissed." He ended the call and asked the waitress to bring his food in a takeout box. It's amazing how quickly things change. 1 minute, Kotep was just staring into space thinking about the Ions gig he'd witnessed the night before at Fitzgerald's, and now he was focused on the distant past and his own future. Of course, as an Egyptologist, his future was often tied to the distant past. After a rush of activity that involved clearing his schedule, booking a flight, and getting packed, Kotep found himself on an intercontinental flight. He was trying to keep his perspective. The whole thing could be a hoax. A previously unseen royal tomb in an area people had scoured over and over again was unusual, and that was an understatement. Then there was the curse. Kotep's friend had told him that the curse was like one he'd never seen before. Whosoever opens this tomb shall have an exceptionally long life and surroundings meant for royalty. It didn't sound like a curse at all. Still, maybe it had been mistranslated. The photo his friend sent wasn't clear enough to really see it well. Maybe once he got there, he'd have a different reading of it. He couldn't get over the fact that he'd never seen any record of this Somantusan. He seemed to be a completely unknown member of the ancient Egyptian ruling class. So many things just didn't add up well. Still, if this finding turned out, he knew his career would be made. He had gone to work at the University of Chicago because its history of Egyptology was legendary. Kotep could find himself carrying on the rich tradition of James Henry Brewster at the very school with which he had so well represented the field of Egyptology. Once Kotep got to Cairo, he and his group made their way to the site. Everything seemed as he'd been told. It seemed incomprehensible, but was a completely unknown tomb right in the middle of all kinds of famous sites. People had frequented the area over and over again for decades and had never been found. Even more surprising to Kotep was that curse. The translation was correct. With all the Egyptian sites that had been unearthed, there was no record of a curse like that one anywhere. Kotep wanted to rush in, but that wouldn't have been prudent. They had to document everything they did in painstaking detail. They spent a couple days photographing and mapping and itemizing everything on the outside before he ever got the chance to break the seal and enter the tomb. Once it was time, he paused at the entrance. He knew his life would never be the same. He was about to become permanently connected to this find. He was going to experience something only so many people in his field had ever experienced. He was about to become the first person to see this particular piece of the past. When he felt that he'd given the experience its due reverence, he opened the seal and went into the tomb. Everything was well preserved, a piece of history frozen for centuries waiting for him to open it. The air was stale, but also sweet in a way. He felt that he was breathing in history. The tomb was rather unspectacular, but it didn't matter. This was his tomb, his find. His name would forever be associated with it. Somehow he felt tied to the history in ways he'd never experienced before. That point was even more telling because he had made a lifetime of studying history. He'd never really felt like he was part of it before. It was something new, and he really liked it. Kotep spent several hours in the tomb looking over everything. He wanted to see it all. He wanted to be the first person to see it all. Once he was satisfied with the experience, he made his way out. He would be flying back home to Berwyn the next day. There was all kinds of work to be done with the tomb, but that was the grunt work. Each item would need to be cataloged, photographed, and recorded. It would be a long process, but that process would be left to the hands of those lower on the totem pole. Kotep knew that he was about to become an important piece of Egyptian history. He had work to do at home. On the flight home, Kotep had a strange dream. He was in ancient Egypt, but that wasn't unusual. He'd had dreams like that since he was young because he'd always been fascinated by that time and place. What was weird was the intensity of the dream. He was a small child, about the same age he was when he became so fascinated with Egyptology. That in itself was novel. Normally in his dreams he was himself. This time he seemed to be someone else. The dream had an air of reality to it. That was true in a very literal sense. He could smell the air. It had elements of the air he'd smelled in the tomb, but it was fresh. There was a smell of exotic plants and animals carried on the air. He could feel the warm sun on his skin. The ground beneath him gave resistance to his feet. It was like he was alive in ancient Egypt, but living someone else's life. When he woke, the memory of the dream really had a life of its own, too. He knew it was a dream, but yet it seemed like a real memory. It was as if he had lived it. Kotep decided that it was part of his new reality of being tied to history. He reveled in it and looked forward to dreams still to come. Life became a whirlwind once he was back home. He was getting updates from the on-site crew several times a day. He was briefing his colleagues. He was working on paperwork to see about getting some of the materials brought to the United States. There were interviews. Kotep had started writing a book about the experience. That list of activity doesn't even include his normal daily routines. He found very little time to himself to just relax. His life had become a flurry of do, do, do. Still, there were moments of reflection here and there. He managed to eat a bag lunch at the lakefront once. He got to a Cubs game because he had bought the tickets months before, and he wasn't going to lose out. They won, too. Somehow he was almost living another life in addition to that one. The dreams had continued. After the first one, he couldn't have thought it possible, but they had become more intense. He found himself seeing through the eyes of that child over and over again. But time was passing in a sequential way in the dream world. It was as if he was connecting to someone there at various points in his life. He was experiencing it for himself. Kotep hadn't told anyone about the dreams. They were his alone. So much of his life now was open to public inspection. He was keeping this part for himself. There were aspects of this dream life that he found troubling, though. The visions weren't confined to dreams anymore. There were times when the world around him seemed to fade during waking hours, and the dream world began to seem like his reality. He'd begun to have trouble separating his memories from the memories of the dream world. Sometimes he felt that his life in the Chicago area in the 21st century was the dream. There was something else, too. At times he could see something ominous. There was a dark shadow that would seem to be watching him from the periphery. It had first shown up in the dreams, but then he had started to see it in reality, too. It really instilled a sense of dread. Yet somehow it felt familiar in a weird way. He felt as if he'd seen it somewhere before. Still, Kotep kept moving forward. His life had taken on aspects of fame and success he'd never thought possible. In the world of Egyptology, he'd become a bit of a rock star. It was something he dreamed of his whole life but thought was unattainable. He was reveling in it and doing the work at the same time. As time went by, the dream world became more and more irresistible. His work had started to suffer. People were noticing. There were times when he would become completely unattached to reality for as long as half an hour. In fact, he found himself spending more and more time in that world, and it really was beginning to feel more like the real one to him. The dreams had become darker, though. The shadow had been getting closer. It was stalking him. It was stalking him in the world of Chicagoland, too. He had also remembered why it was so familiar. He had seen it in a dark corner of the tomb. In the excitement of the moment, he hadn't really paid much attention to it. All the other wonders of the tomb had led him to forget he'd even seen it at all, yet he had. Well, at least he thought he had. He really couldn't trust his memories anymore. Kotep was marking a milestone. It was 6 months to the day since he'd entered the tomb. Or was it? He really couldn't figure out which world was real and which wasn't. In one of those worlds, though, he was sitting in his office, the one at his Berwyn home, not the one at the university. He'd been staying in his home a lot more. It was too hard to appear to be holding things together in public. He decided that no matter what was going on, this was a moment to remember. He opened a bottle of champagne to toast the occasion. Damned right I'm drinking alone, he thought. As he was pouring the wine into his glass, he saw the shadow. It was fully developed. It was blocking out the sunlight from his window. For a moment, he saw the other world, too. His reality in that universe was taking a turn for the worse. Death was coming. He'd been ill with a fever in that world, and the infection was about to claim him. Just as that version of himself drew his last breath, Kotep became aware of the 21st century reality and saw the shadow at his face. It engulfed him. No one heard from Kotep after that. Police were sent to his home for a welfare check, but they never found him. His disappearance was a mystery that was never solved. It became a part of the folklore of the Somantusan discovery. Everything went dark for Kotep when the shadow hit him. For a time there was nothing. Then he had a sense of being wrapped in cloth. He couldn't see, but his mind worked. He found himself trapped inside his own mind. He could not move his body at all. He had the sensation that he could hear, but there didn't seem to be much sound to hear. Even his beloved Egyptian dreams were gone. He was alive, but trapped in some sort of living death he couldn't really comprehend. He had plenty of time to try to understand, but the years, he thought it was years, he couldn't be sure, dragged on, and he started losing his sanity over time. How could one remain sane with such an existence? Dr. Thompson, a voice on the phone said, "We found a new tomb. It's one that has somehow been missed all these years. It seems to be completely pristine and unopened. The inscription says the tomb holds someone named Grekotep."
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.